welcome to the Book of Mormon Evidence podcast with host Rod Meldrum. This week's Come Follow Me supplemental study is Lesson 18, Mosiah chapters 11 through 17, a light that can never be darkened. This week's guest is Amberli Nelson, an ancient sacred Jewish symbology expert. This is part 1 in 2 parts. Amberli received a BS in sociology from Brigham Young University in '94 and recently completed her master's degree in athletic administration. She thoroughly enjoys researching subjects she is most passionate about, which include sacred symbology, the Book of Mormon, early church history, and Jewish religious customs. She's also an expert on ancient Jewish practices, especially those involving the Law of Moses. Amberli and her family reside in Salem, Utah.
Okay, welcome to another episode and another podcast for the Book of Mormon Evidence series on the Come Follow Me program. We have with us, Amberli Nelson, and excited about sharing with you some of the amazing research that she has done over this last number of years, and this covers a lot of different things. And so one of the things that we have had such an amazing experience with learning more from Amberli about things like the laws of Moses. She spent years studying the laws of Moses and the symbolism and things there. Things like the plants and the animals that are mentioned in the Book of Mormon and what that might indicate as far as its geography and where things may have happened. About the certain symbolisms and so forth that are found in some of the ancient sites in North America. And so I wanted to start off actually by thank you for coming. We're glad to have you here. And we want to actually, why don't you start off a little bit by just tell us a little bit more about yourself, a little bit about your background.
So I have always been fascinated with groups of people, and especially their theologies and their cultures. And as a young child, I was very interested in different types of religion. And as a young girl, I watched a series on television called Mosiah, and it was about the destruction in Jerusalem and Israel in 70 AD by the Romans, and it was a compelling story that really grabbed my attention and really just pushed me into wanting to study more about who these people were that died up there on that mountain and why, and why they were willing to take their own lives than to become slaves to the Romans. And so that just propelled me throughout my life, and I love to study and read. And then at BYU, my degree there as an undergrad was in sociology, because I was able to develop that more and learn more about the groups and study of people. And then I just kept studying and learning on my own and researching. and all these years later, here we are. It's just been a passion and hobby of mine. So
You bet. Well, I actually had the privilege of meeting you actually for the first time on the phone.
Yes, I remember.
And I'll never forget that conversation. And we were having a big conference up in Boise, Idaho, which used to live there. And there had been numerous people that said, there's this lady up here who has this amazing information, and you really ought to have her speak at the conference. And I usually don't let people just speak unless I've heard them before, but in less than 5 minutes I knew that what you had to share was absolutely amazing. It was just so jaw-dropping for most of the people that were there. Had such an amazing experience to hear some of the research and information that you were sharing. So that's why we wanted to talk to all of our guests here about some of the different things. And we'll start off, again, we are using the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon as kind of a reference material for these podcasts. Again, we want to reiterate that this is not to take the place of the lessons, that we expect that you are going through the lessons on your own and doing that. But this is for those who want to dig a little bit deeper, that want to have a more vibrant experience with the Book of Mormon, and be able to really come to an understanding and excitement. Because has that been the case for you as you've done this research? How does it make you feel about the Book of Mormon?
Oh man, I'm so glad you asked, because I've been pondering that the last few days, so much so that I went through my phone tonight and dug up a quote that I had heard. We've all heard for many years by President Benson, and it got me. It sort of encapsulated why I'm so excited, because there is a power that comes into your life when you dig into this book. And if that's okay, I'd love to just read it real quick. It's from President Benson. President Benson. And This is what he says. It was in a talk he gave. I'm not sure of the year, but he was talking about the Book of Mormon like he frequently did, and did such a beautiful, eloquent job with it all the time. But this is what he had to say, and man, it nails it on the head, hits the nail on the head. And he says this: "It is not just that the Book of Mormon teaches us truth, though indeed it indeed does that. It is not just that the Book of Mormon bears testimony of Christ, though it indeed does that too. But there is something more. There is a power in the book which will begin to flow into your lives the moment you begin a serious study of the book. You will find greater power to resist temptation. You will find the power to avoid deception. You will find the power to stay on the straight and narrow path. The scriptures are called the words of life, and nowhere is that more true than it is of the Book of Mormon. When you begin to hunger and thirst after those words, you will find life in greater and greater abundance." Close quote. And Rod, I just need to tell you and bear my own personal witness and testimony of that truth, that it's exciting to me because as I hunger and thirst after these words, I do find a sense of greater abundance in my life. I find power to avoid deception. These words spoken by this prophet, President Benson, are real and true. And as they pertain to this book, I add my second witness and say, absolutely 100%, there is power. And the more excitement you have and the more thirsting you have, it feels like it never can get slaked, that thirst. You just want more. And so some of these things that we talk about and study, they add layers and depths that just bring it to life and make it exciting. And this journey becomes this treasure hunt. And, you're just Indiana Jones out there, and you're finding these things, and they're so enlivening and illuminating, and they bring a power to your life that I can honestly attest to. So.
Yeah. I love what you're saying there, but I also know from experience and also from knowing you and so forth that these things, these nuggets of truth and these treasures don't come without some level of sacrifice, some level of putting yourself out there, of effort and struggle, and without that struggle, you just don't get it a lot of times. You just cannot really get there until you've put in the effort to do this. So some of these things, it doesn't just fall in your lap.
Nope. The old adage, there's no free lunch. Well, there's no free knowledge.
Yeah. And
your knowledge, the knowledge that you obtain and attain is always going to come at a price. And that's the point. It needs to be something that you're willing to sacrifice for, because only then do you value it. Yeah. And so absolutely the time and effort that you put into searching this book, searching these sacred and holy words, pays back in spades, because that sacrifice just gets blessed in abundance and blessings on your head and and your life and your family. So it is worth the sacrifice.
Yeah, and that's one of the other things I was going to mention, is that when it comes down to making these kind of sacrifices, each of us can listen to other people, and these podcasts are basically about giving people additional insights and information. But everybody who's ever taught a class knows that the one who learns the most from the class is the teacher.
Amen.
So our hope is that not so much that we're going to give you this information and you can just assimilate it, because you'll never assimilate it until you pay the price yourself. So that's why we want to have you encourage you to go out, take the information that we're going to be sharing with you during this podcast, and search it out for yourself and learn. As you do that, as you put in that work, then you will be able to start to assimilate this, and you'll be able to have an even more depth of understanding and knowledge, and the Book of Mormon will truly come alive, just like Amberli just bore witness to.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it, is the Holy Ghost comes in and then just expounds these ideas and principles in your mind. So we're hoping and wanting to lure you in with some gems and some nuggets and get you excited about it. Then you pick up that torch and go and dig in, and pretty soon you're finding all those gems and nuggets and more and more and more, and it just keeps going. And so, this is a beckoning, an invitation to just dig and sift and search. It's so beautiful.
And when you do that, then you can bless a lot of people's lives. That's what
Yes.
Amberli has been doing. In fact, we have there's over a dozen pages or something like that in the annotated Book of Mormon that that talk about your work. Some of the things that you've been involved with and how you've come about this. So let's start off then real quick. If you have your annotated Book of Mormon handy, go ahead and pull it open. And we're going to start actually on page 5 with the very first mention of the Law of Moses in the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask Amberli just a couple of quick questions to begin with. So the Law of Moses,
Okay.
where does it come from?
So actually, it's page 7, just for the audience here. Yeah, you want to jump one more page there. So the Law of Moses, and we find this, Nephi's talking about this in verse 15. Is that it was engraven upon the plates of brass, and he goes on to describe it a little bit more, that it was the 5 books of Moses. And when he says that, he means Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. And that is where the bulk of the Law of Moses was written, through the Law of Moses being what Jehovah gave to Moses to instruct and guide his people. And and it's very specific law in a lot of ways, very, very detailed, very specific. But that was recorded on the plates of brass, a portion and a part of the plates of brass. Now, the plates of brass were much more comprehensive than just those 5 books, but those 5 books are found there. And so it really details this Law of Moses. And
What would you say is the primary purpose, do you think, of the Lord giving the Law of Moses to the Israelites?
well, because that's a great question that's answered here when he said that when Nephi was finding himself getting that command, that seemingly very contradictory, if you will, command to take Laban's life in order to get these plates. And Nephi is standing there, I can imagine, in a kind of a stunned silence, thinking, I need to kill this man for these plates.
Yeah.
And the Lord's telling him, yes, that you need to slay him, and that the Lord, we're reading in verse 13 here, the Lord slayeth the wicked to bring forth his righteous purposes. And it is better that one man should perish than a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. And what right there, we're getting the fact that he's asking Nephi and Lehi, of course, and that family, to go over to a new land, what would be the promised land, and build a nation. Literally a nation. And to do that, they needed these plates, and they needed these laws and commandments. And so he said, following down here, now into verse 14, he said, so the Lord put that as a reminder in his head when he's saying, yes, you need to take Laban's life, and this is why. And then Nephi tells us that when I'd heard these things, I remembered the words of the Lord, that the Lord had spoken him to in the wilderness, saying that inasmuch as thy seed shall keep my commandments, they shall prosper in the land of promise. Yea, and this is Nephi talking, I also thought that they, the people he's taking with them, their people, could not keep the commandments of the Lord according to the law of Moses, save they should have the law. In other words, if the Lord's going to ask us to keep his commandments, we need to know what they are, we need to have access to them, and we need to take them with us. And so this becomes...
And people don't just remember things. I mean,
No. No.
Over the course of a week, sometimes I can't remember things. Over the course of years, you forget a lot of things. But over the
Yes.
course of centuries, people can forget completely
Yes.
these things. So if they're not written down, they are going to be lost.
Yes, and the language can get corrupted within as early as 70 years. In fact, we see that exact scenario with the Mulekites, because when Mosiah finds the land of Zarahemla, of course, it's populated by who? The Mulekites. And they didn't recognize, yes, they came from the same exact spot, basically, in Jerusalem at the exact same time. And yet they couldn't even understand each other. They couldn't talk amongst each other because the Mulekites did not bring records. They didn't bring, and they didn't write. And so when that happens, that language gets corrupted very quickly. And so they had no written language. They had no written records. But Nephi did because of this. And so it kept the language.
Even when you have a written record, sometimes language can change dramatically in just one generation.
Look at ours.
When I grew up, I grew up on a dairy farm, and if my dad was to come up to me and say the word mouse, for example, the first thing in my mind is that, the little furry critters that run around in the haystacks, when we're feeding the cows or whatever, or when we're hauling hay. But if I walk up to one of my kids and say the word mouse, what's in their mind? This little
computer
thing that connects them to the whole world, you know.
Absolutely.
So I mean, it's a totally different idea, and that's just in one generation.
Absolutely. Well, now in just the last 15 years, we have a texting language. if someone was to try to make sense of our texting language, they'd LOL.
Yeah, what is LOL?
You know. So yes, written language
Exactly.
and records are very important. So the Lord needed that, and He knew that they needed to keep these commandments, and so therefore they needed that law,
Right.
and that was on the plates of brass.
Yep, needed to be written down.
Yep.
Yeah. So but the law of Moses. So you are kind of an expert on this law of Moses. It involved a lot of things, and one of the things I found was really just fascinating about your research is the fact that really, when you consider that Christ started his, he initiated the gospel over there, but it didn't last long before they lost it. Mm-hmm. And then when the gospel was reestablished in the latter days by Joseph Smith, I mean, it's been barely 200 years, and we haven't lost it, but I mean, it's only 200 years. I mean, we're talking about the law of Moses was able to keep people focused on Christ for centuries. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's really interesting because Nephi makes a point to tell his people very early on, even before the promise, I believe it's before they even got to the promised land, that Christ would not be coming for 600 years. And he laid that number out to them. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that.
And the Israelites had to be living the laws of Moses long before Lehi's time.
Absolutely. And so knowing that, they needed this record to really tether themselves to the reality of this Messiah and who he was and what his life would be about and his mission, and especially and most importantly, his death and what that was about for them, and what that would mean, and that atonement that he would perform.
And this is the person who's going to be in the future. I mean, it's not even somebody that they can relate to, because it's going to be way in the future, long before or long after their lives are long over.
Exactly. And we have such an advantage now that we get to read the New Testament and read these scriptures and know that event happened, and we can have such great faith in it. It is documented, it happened, and we have such an advantage. And they had to have hope in this being who would come. They had to believe in the prophecies, and they had to look and long for those days when he would come. And so what this law did was it was written by him, of course. It was written by Jehovah himself. And what it did was he imbued his life and his essence and his purposes and his mission and details about what it would be like, i.e. Passover, and these things that he taught through the law that was found in like Leviticus and those books, Exodus and those, and that they could then use those events and those details to understand and construct a tethering to him, mm-hmm. that would keep them knowing him and seeking him, even though they knew he wouldn't come for 600 years. So that was super important for them to have that knowledge, and they loved it. And Jacob is so beautiful. Jacob is one of my favorites because, in Jacob 2, 3, 4, he's talking about how important the law was to them because it gave them hope in him, and they delighted in it. It wasn't just a set of strict, to-dos, not to-dos, that kind of thing.
So it wasn't just like the commandments.
No.
It was much more than that.
Much more than that.
And it involved not just a belief system, but almost like a cultural thing.
Absolutely, a way of life.
Okay, you got to tell us about some of the cultural things that go on.
Well, it was a way of life. It was it was the way they interacted with the details, the foods in their lives, the animals that they raised, the crops that they raised, and the value that they had on those, because they all had a symbolic value in this law that they would use in these special holy days that were set apart in Leviticus. And there's 7 of them, but let's talk about, for example, on Passover, and that how they were to take that lamb at day 10, and they were to have it in their home until the 14th day, upon which they would then take it to the temple to be sacrificed, and those 4 days, and they got attached to it, and it was a sacrifice for these families to take this lamb knowing it was going to be slaughtered, and then that it had to be a white male 1-year-old lamb with spotless and perfect, and that lamb would then take upon them their sins. And what a powerful, visceral experience that these families had in just that one, watching, participating in it, and knowing that was in similitude of the Messiah who was coming, and that it could show them and reassure them and reaffirm that he was going to come, and that's what he was going to do for them. And that was so important. So every aspect of their lives really had found some kind of relevance or context for this law. It wasn't just arbitrary. Yes, there's a long list of things, and it, it may seem to us very arduous and long and detailed, but for them, it was a way of keeping and bringing the Messiah into their lives in a way that he was real and there and present with them.
Yeah, I think one of the other things, the other message that I've gotten from some of your other research, and that is that they actually kind of looked forward to this.
Very much.
Because the cultural things had to do with celebrations.
Yes. Yep.
And these things would be, and I know you call them rehearsals. Or convocations.
Convocations, yeah.
And that's what they were doing. They were rehearsing and basically preparing for the day, 600 years into the future, when their children's children would be maybe possibly there when this individual actually lives and that these things are fulfilled.
Yep.
But it's interesting how we in the church, I think we don't really spend much time or learn much about the laws of Moses in general. And as you have taught me and all the people associated with us about these laws of Moses and how integral it was in their life and how it was able to keep people focused on Christ for much longer than Christ's own gospel did and after his life for hundreds and hundreds of years. Kept people focused on his life.
Yeah.
So that is a pretty amazing thing, and yet we kind of about what most members of the church know about the laws of Moses. Oh, it was fulfilled.
Yeah. No.
And that's about it.
Well, and actually, he was only talking about the animal sacrifice being fulfilled anyway. So yes. But interesting you say that about this idea of keeping people, because that's what Korihor came in, and that's where that was his target. That was his end, was to these people to say, "Oh, you're kidding me! You're going to believe in a being that's yet to come, that's supposedly coming, 600 years. Not well, but that time it wasn't 600, but hundreds of years hence. You really think that's going to happen?
He's going to bind you down with all of these ordinances and all these things and so forth. Yeah,
because supposedly there's going to be this being come someday, and so. And for some people, he was able to lead them astray because it kind of appealed to the sense of logic, if you will, that and so. But this isn't logic. This is spiritual. This is belief. This is faith. And so you're right. They were rehearsals and what each of these holy days. And I talk about the 7 holy days in this one.
Yeah, this is awesome.
Yeah, Jehovah's holy days in the heartland of North America. And what I go through each of the 7. There's 7 total. There's 3 in the spring, 1 in the summer, and 3 in the fall. And each one represents an aspect, a rehearsal of his life, of his mission, or an aspect of what he's coming to do. And so, for example, with Passover, of course, it's a rehearsal of his death, and it's in very detailed and beautiful ways. And so I go through how each one of those rehearses, basically is a in similitude of his life in many different ways. But the details are beautiful and fascinating. So I go through each of those there. And because, like I said, they all point to his life, his mission, and his death in various ways.
So his entire mission is basically encapsulated in these 7 yearly festivals that they have. Wow.
Yeah, along with daily living too. But I'll give you one quick example out of in the week of Passover. There's the feast of the feast of unleavened bread, and then on the 3 days after the lamb is sacrificed, they raise barley. The feast of
first fruits.
Yeah, the feast of first fruits. And what they do is, because barley is the first, fruit of that's the first harvest.
The ripening
of the spring,
because it's actually planted in the fall.
Yeah, it's planted, and then they actually start their calendar and base their calendar on the ripening of barley. That is the start.
That's mind blowing
of the whole year.
For most people,
right.
Wait a minute, they have barley. God gave them barley so they could keep their calendar straight.
Exactly, because Passover, it has to be at a certain ripened stage for them to start their calendar, and the calendar starts these holy days. But so they on the 3rd day, think about the parallels here. On the 3rd day, they raise they bring their barley to the priest, and the priest raises it up and waves it in the air as this wave offering. But what did Jesus do on the third day? Right? He was the first fruits that were raised up. And Lehi uses that exact phrase. He talks about the Savior in the context of first fruits. And he's talking about the Savior. And what
so not only did the Nephites actually talk about that they were living the laws of Moses, but actually, I know you bring out the fact that they say that they were strictly living the laws of
Very
Moses.
much.
And not only did they say that, but there's also scriptures that indicate them in action, in doing this.
Very much.
And you talk about this in a couple of your DVDs as well.
Yeah, so in this one is the 5 scriptures that validate the heartland model for the location of the Book of Mormon. And so what I do is take what we talk about in here is this great foundation of all these practices and rehearsals and holy days, and then...
If you want to know about the laws of Moses and the symbolism and so forth there, let me tell you that is the go-to in-depth research on that. It's
pretty fascinating. And so then with this, we take and I show 5 different. Well, there's actually more than 5, but 5 sounded good for a title. Where we show them actually in putting these practices, these beliefs into daily life, into circumstances and events and different things that happen within the book itself. For example, when Korihor comes along and is asking them, why are you doing these sacrifices, and why are you these priests, and he's going out saying you're glutting yourself on the labors of the people, because part of the law of Moses is there's 5 different types of sacrifices that need to be made based on what you're trying to atone for, essentially. Like there's a sin offering, and there's 5 total ones, and there's a peace offering and a trespass offering, and so based on what you're trying to make right with your neighbor or the Lord or whatever it is, it dictates what type of animal you bring to the priest, who sacrifices it, and different things with the altar. But some of those, as spelled out in Leviticus and the other five books, priest. Yeah, some of that goes to the priest, whether it's some of the money or some of the leftover meat or
roast.
Yes. And so Korihor comes along and tries to kind of exploit that and say, oh, really, these are just the traditions of your fathers. Why are you doing this? This seems ridiculous. You guys would bring all this to the priests. And basically he's explaining or showing in this dialogue he's having that
the priests actually get quite a bit of stuff too.
Absolutely. Yeah. But that's how they make their living.
How they live. Yeah.
And that's how it was spelled out in the 5 books of Moses. And so it's what the Lord intended.
But Korihor didn't get the fact that this was the symbolism, the symbolic aspect of this whole thing, and the reasons behind it. He just looked at it as being just simply that the priests were
glutting themselves,
getting rich, basically, if you will, off of the sacrifices of the people,
based on the false traditions of their fathers. Yeah. And then another one, just real quick, you can talk about is King Benjamin. Before he gives his epic speech to the people, his great sermon, what do? They perform their sacrifices, the firstlings of their flocks, and they go through those sacrifices, which is part of the law of Moses, and he makes it very clear, and it's right there to see that they are living that they were doing what they said they were doing, which was living those laws strictly, and that's their way of honoring the Lord and staying connected with the Messiah who was coming, and that's just what they did. So.
Well, let's see if we can. We've got so many wonderful things to cover, but let's go. So those of you have the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon. If you go over here to page 38, this is 1 Nephi chapter 18. This is the animals and the plants and so forth that are found in the Promised Land, and I'd like for you to just address for us. What significance are these animals? I mean, why is it that Nephi put this in his small plates? Now, this is again, we want to reiterate the fact that we have the large plates of Nephi. The first 116 pages were lost, which is the book of Lehi, and so we don't have that. So then the Lord gave Joseph Smith the small plates of Nephi, and that's what we have. So this is Nephi's account essentially on the small plates of Nephi, and then those who came after him. But here we have an explanation. He said this was the more spiritual part, But yet he's talking about physical things. So maybe there's a spiritual reason for this. I think Amberly's going to shed some light on that.
Yeah.
But let me just read really quickly. This is from 1 Nephi chapter 18. Again, it is on page 38. So verse 25. And it came to pass that we did find upon the land of promise, as we journeyed in the wilderness, that there were beasts in the forest of every kind, both the cow and the ox and the ass and the horse and the goat and the wild goat, and all manner of wild animals which were for the use of man. And we did find all manner of ore, both of gold and of silver and of copper. This sounds like kind of the more secular part of the history. So clearly this was thought to be more of the spiritual part. What would be the significance of having, for example, cows and goats and an ox and so forth? Would there be any significance to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to what we had just talked about with these offerings, these 5 offerings, remember I told you based on what you were bringing to the priest, some required a cow and a bull. Some of those sacrifices required...
in order to live the law of Moses.
Yes, to live the law of Moses. They literally had to have these exact animals, which is so interesting that this list that Nephi gives us was verifying the fact that the Lord wanted them to live this law. That's why he commanded them. That's why he sent the plates of brass with them, but to make sure that it could, they could follow through. Right. Because, to let them and allow them to follow through with his commandments. He then therefore provided them everything they needed. So Nephi was kind of saying, oh, he gave us this law and it's a spiritual law and we're determined to live it. And so of course, it's no surprise to him when he landed, everything that was needed to live this law was there. And so he's giving us this list because every one of those, well, most all of them
we have
absolutely are necessary for this law.
And we have no evidence that they actually brought these animals with them on the ship.
No.
Whereas with the Jaredites, it's a little bit different situation. They apparently did bring a lot of the animals with them on their barges.
Yes. But
here with Lehi and his family and their voyage, they said they gathered fruit and honey in abundance and so forth, and then they left and went on the ship. They didn't say anything about bringing the animals. So when they got here, the animals had to basically be here. Yeah. And who commanded them to do this? The Lord.
The Lord.
And I love this question, and you brought it up, and I just wanted to reiterate the fact that it says you've said, I think the question goes something like, why would the Lord bring these people to a promised land, then command them to live the laws of Moses, and then bring them to a land that was devoid of the very animals that were required so they could live it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We just got to go right back to 1 Nephi 3:7. And when the Lord commands, he prepares the way to keep his command. Yeah. So he takes them to a land where we read that these things are found in abundance, and they are found in the forests and beasts of every kind. And then he names them. And it's because he's trying to give, I believe, praise and glory to the Lord. He gave us this command and these laws, and look, he has provided a way that we can live them. Yeah. And to go anywhere but North America.
Yeah, we did find upon the promise on the land of promise.
That's right. So we know that by that we can say, okay, so the land of promise contained these things. Now, when you go anywhere else and try to establish that as the promised land, I suggest to those people who do, the first thing you need to show me then is this list.
So it's the animals.
Can you show me this list? Can you account in your archaeology for these animals? And I took that on as my quest before I actually ever heard of you and your work. Mm-hmm. This was my own research because to me I was trying to figure out what was who and where and where and this kind of thing. And so I thought, well, the answer is going to be for me where I find this list. Yeah. So I went through the archaeology of Mesoamerica and found that these aren't there.
Which, by the way, is an interesting... there's been a lot of different people who proposed a lot of different ways of trying to figure out where this promised land is of the Book of Mormon. Mm-hmm. Everything from speculations about narrow necks of land, and then where's the different where's a place where there's volcanoes? Yes. Where is a place where the ores and so forth exist? Mm-hmm. But this was really unique, which was one of the reasons why I was so impressed with your initial research, and the first time I heard you, it's actually what it wasn't even so much about this, but bottom line is that you have really hit upon a criterion that has never been addressed. I mean, not directly that I'm aware of in the whole Book of Mormon evidences genre of information is, where do we find the plants and animals of the Book of Mormon? It's kind of just assumed that, in fact, what has been assumed in many cases is that the animals that are listed in here are basically misnamed.
Yes.
That horses really don't mean horses.
Yeah.
That cows and oxen don't really mean cows and oxen. That sheep aren't really sheep.
Yep.
And that's another aspect of this that is new. It's refreshing for those of you who haven't been following this research for very long. I think you'll find this is really pretty profound. What Amberli has discovered.
Well, and unfortunately, and this was a big thrust of why I felt so passionate about it, because I came to be, in the years the internet has taken such a hold and been such a wealth of resource and information for us, that people began to want to search for proof of the Book of Mormon, and when they Google these things and take them down to these locations that other people are, proponents of, and find that they don't exist, they want to discount the book itself and say, oh, then therefore the book's not true, and this and that. And that was unfortunate to me, because absolutely the book is true, first of all, but second of all, we can produce this proof. I counted for every one of these, absolutely, I counted for every one of these animals in the archaeological record of North America. So it's not that they don't exist, it's just, where are you looking? Are you looking in North America? Because if you are, we have them. All of them. They're all accounted for. And the plants and animals too, because that was another big one where people were saying, well, down in for example, let me use this example. In Mesoamerica, barley's not grown and wheat wasn't grown anciently, and it's not the right climate and the right, growing.
It won't even hardly grow even today.
Today, they have a rainy, rainforesty kind of climate. Well, what's interesting is, so when the Lord picks a promised land and knows the people need to grow these crops to keep the law, which barley and wheat are absolutely essential to the law of Moses. So he needs to provide them with the right growing climate to be able to do that. Well, what's interesting is North America sits directly, on a as far as latitude straight across from Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So whatever was grown there would be able to be grown here in North America, which is why right in the verse before the one you read, he said that they began to plant the seeds that they brought with them. And we did put all our seeds into the earth, which we had brought from the land of Jerusalem. They brought their wheat and their barley, knowing that they would need to grow those to keep the law. And they did grow exceedingly, and they were blessed in abundance. So we know that they grew barley and wheat. And we know they had these animals, and that's a great foundation for understanding where this all took place. Yeah. And that it's true, and we have it all on record here in the archaeological record. So,
in fact, we have a little quote from you at the bottom. You mind if I read that?
Oh, great! No, go ahead.
It'd probably be better if you read it. It's your quote. Go ahead.
Okay, so here I say, Nephi lists those animals that are essential in keeping the law of Moses. The Lord, who gave the law of Moses for the typifying of Christ, provided the family of Lehi a land that was filled with those specific beasts needed to perform sacred, symbolic ceremonies to maintain the covenants he gave to the house of Israel. And so, of course, our God of abundance and preparation and omniscience would know to have the land and the climate there for them to do this.
Ready.
Yes.
So that they could actually live the law.
Yes.
That he commanded them.
And unfortunately, in Mesoamerica, they have never still been able to find any traces of cultivating wheat or barley anciently, and that's been problematic for people wanting to kind of.
You have a list of like 10 or 12 things. I mean, and there's a lot of them. I think you've already mentioned. We've mentioned a few of these things. Animals and some of the plants and so forth. If you want to get the complete list, you can.
Yep, that's in actually both of these.
Both of these, yes.
Yeah.
It's in both of those, yes.
And the little tidbit I'll give on that is, you'll see in here as you look through these videos, but I give a list where I compare. There's the 10 essential items, and then I put the scripture that they're found in the book, because that's important. If those items are in the law, then they need to be found in the book, and they are. And then I say, then there's the column of if they're found in North America and where, and if they're found in Mesoamerica. And what's interesting is 9 of the 10 items are not found in Mesoamerica, but 10 of 10 items are found in North America, all 10. Only 1 of them are found in Mesoamerica. So that's something to think about anciently.
And that was, what was that, palms or something?
Palm leaves, yeah. Palm leaves are used in the Feast of Tabernacles, which is late in the...
Yeah. When we get into this a little bit further, we'll have Amberli kind of explain just what each one of the different feasts kind of a little bit more in detail there. So in talking about that, now Amberli's already mentioned a little bit about that, but if we go to page 160 in the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon, this is talking about the right here in Mosiah chapter 9. And so I'll read this, and this is from Mosiah chapter 9, verse 8. It says, and we began to build buildings and to repair the walls of the city, yea, even the walls of the city of Lehi Nephi and the city of Shilom. And we began to till the ground, yea, even with all manner of seeds, with seeds of corn and wheat and barley, and with Neas and Sheem, which we don't really have any idea what that might be.
With some form of
and with seeds of all manner of fruits, and we did begin to multiply and prosper in the land. So they do mention 3 specific plants that we know today exist, and those are basically corn, wheat, and barley. Mm-hmm. Which of those are used in the Law of Moses?
So all 3, but very specifically wheat and barley at different feasts. So wheat is used in one that is called Shavuot, and that's the one in the summer. But barley, of course, is used in the fall, or excuse me, in the spring.
First fruits.
Feast of First Fruits. Mm-hmm. That actually is a direct symbol of the raising up of Jesus Christ in resurrection on the 3rd day. It can't be any more powerful than a symbol directly tied to that event, the most important event in history. Yeah. and it's represented through barley, and that's why I find it so interesting that barley is what sets that calendar for the entire year for the Nephites, is that when that barley is ripe, that's when the count begins, and they can establish when Passover is going to be that year. If it's not ripe, they put off Passover for another month. That's how important barley was. So they
essentially added another month to that Hebrew calendar year.
Exactly. In a sense, it's a little more complicated than that, but essentially that's what's happening. And so, because of course, why? If that's the crop that is going to represent him and his supernal act that saves all of us, then the calendar is going to be set based on that. And if you don't have the seeds, which they did luckily, but of course providentially, but then to have the place to grow that and harvest it in a land where that would be abundant, then how do we follow through? How would they follow through with that without having that?
And even, and this is something that I just have thought about even since learning more about your research, and that is that if they were at a different latitude, mm-hmm. and if barley did grow at that latitude, it would probably come up in a very different time of the year as far as the Gregorian calendar is concerned.
That's a good point.
And thereby throwing off their entire calendar system. Mm-hmm. Because you have to be basically on about the same latitude mm-hmm. for the barley to ripen, whether it's in Jerusalem or here in America, mm-hmm. It has to ripen about the same time for that to be used in the calendar.
Exactly.
But if it was way further south, 1,000 miles further south on the mm-hmm. earth, then it will ripen in a different time frame.
That's why I call barley the smoking gun, if you will. And I actually say, if we want to be able to,
a lot of smoking guns.
That's true. But I say, if you want to, distill down, geographical, insight and information to one word or one object, and I hold up my bundle of barley and I say, here we have it, folks, because of its importance.
Yeah. And also, just for information's sake, I mean, barley. So as we realize that this is important, archaeologically speaking, there's also overwhelming evidence that they had barley.
Oh, 100%.
And that's actually
on
page 160.
Yeah, I found this here. This placard is, you took a photo of it. This is your photo, and this is in Fort Ancient up there in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And it's talking about, this comes from the Ohio Archaeological Society, right?
It's Fort Ancient, actually.
Yeah.
This is actually
mm-hmm.
located. Yeah.
Where they are stating, as clear as can be, that barley was a prominent crop for Middle Woodland Hopewell Indians in Illinois, and that it was harvested.
By the way, Middle Hopeland, just for those of you who are not Middle Woodland, I should say. We got Hopeland.
Yeah.
Hopewell and Woodland.
Hopewell,
by the way, in the Middle Woodland time frame, which is basically the middle of Book of Mormon time frames, mm-hmm. is when all of a sudden barley became a prominent crop. It wasn't a prominent crop until they got there.
Yes. That's a good point too. And it makes it very clear. It was harvested in the spring when other foods may have been scarce, is their explanation. But the point we're pulling out is it was harvested in the spring.
Yeah.
And of course it would be, because that's when they needed it.
And you also need to have spring, which means you need to have seasons.
Oh, yes, exactly. Oh, another very good point. Very good point.
In order to have these plants, it requires seasons. And there's another plant that we're going to get into in just a few minutes, and you've kind of been you haven't alluded to it yet, but I know it's coming, and that is well, we're going to get to it here in just a minute.
Okay, but I will say, interestingly enough, because barley is planted in the cold weather, like you said, in the fall, and it germinates and grows and whatever it does, and throughout the winter, and then comes up in the spring. So we need that season.
We need a cold season.
We need a
winter.
We need a winter.
Yeah. So if you want to learn more about the ripening of barley and the law of Moses and how that all plays out, this has got a whole section here on page 160 in the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon. You can read more about that.
Yep.
But we need to move along here. So let's run over here to the actual 7 feasts.
Okay.
This is page 169.
69. Okay.
And basically what this says here, now this is actually, now we're going to Mosiah, so this is page 168 in your annotated edition of the Book of Mormon, so 168, Mosiah chapter 13, and starting with verse 17.
Okay.
And actually, maybe we could go up to start, it's talking about the commandments, which obviously now at this point in time, they still remember what the commandments are. Why?
Very much.
Because they have the brass plates.
That's
They
right.
have the record.
Yep.
So he says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. This is verse 18. But the 7th day, the Sabbath of the Lord thy God, thou shalt not do any work. The 7th day.
Yep.
Now, in order to know the 7th day, the Lord himself set up some interesting things in the creation of the earth. That the earth was organized and put together in 6 of the Lord's days, which are the 1,000 years each, according to the Lord. So there was 6,000 years of organization, basically, if you will, and then there was the 7th day for rest. And then the Hebrew calendar is set up essentially so that you have, if I understand you correctly, the Hebrew calendar is all based on the lunar cycles, which are approximately 28 days. It's a little over 28 days. But if you take 28 days and you divide it in half, that gives you 14. If you divide each one of those in half, now it gives you 7-day week. So every time that you have a full moon and it comes back to a full moon again, or a new moon and it comes back to a new moon again, there's going to be that 28-day cycle in between. And all you have to do is basically divide it into 4 equal parts, and you have 7-day weeks.
Yes.
Now you have a calendar system based on a celestial object that keeps you in line with the 7 days. And so now 6 days to do your work. 7 days is the Lord's day, the Sabbath. And you can do that 4 times, and then it recycles.
Yep. And then you get your new moon and you start again.
Which is one of the reasons where did the Hebrew calendar system come from in the first place?
Yeah.
What is its origin?
Yeah, so from the Lord. And so for them, this was very important because they really held that so strongly that, interestingly enough, Native American tribes that are still up in the northeast part of this country, they, when at first contact and when settlers began to interact with them, they were still doing this.
They still tell time based on...
And have their 7th-day Sabbath.
and that's the reason why they say many moons ago, right?
Exactly, many moons ago. Yes.
Many moons ago. And in the Book of Mormon, it talks specifically about, like, for example, we know that they were using this Hebrew lunar calendar system because when Coriantumr, the last Jaredite, walks into the camp, they said that he was with them for
9 moons.
9 moons, which means that they were, again, still telling time based on this lunar calendar system.
Yes.
But one of the other things I wanted to bring up here, though, what about in Central America?
So
the Mayans,
right? They have.
I know you've done some studying about their calendar systems, and how do they reckon a 7-year, or excuse me, a 7-day week?
So they have very, very intricate, very complicated, very actually amazing calendars, and several. There's more than several, but several main ones that they use, and they're very sophisticated and are amazing, quite honestly. But none of them reckon in this way with the 7.
Yeah, they have the long count.
Yeah, they have a long
short
count, and then I believe there's a 13-day, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while, but yes, the point the salient point there is that they don't have this type, and that's extremely important.
In other words, there's no way from the Mayan calendar system that you could ever really come up with a consistent 7-day week where you have 6 days.
That's right.
And then you take your Sabbath, and you have 6 more days, and then you take your Sabbath, because it was not lunar based.
Right.
It was more of a solar based. Well, they had some lunar based aspects too, but the main calendar system was basically solar based, and you can't get a 7-day week
on
from
the rising of the
system.
sun. Absolutely. The solar aspect is very important. The solstices and the equinoxes, and that's extremely valuable and useful, especially in agriculture and whatnot.
Yes.
But for this purpose, then this was how it was reckoned for them.
Okay, so talking about this, the 7th day, the Sabbath of the Lord, and so forth. There are 7. So not only is there 7 days, but there's also these 7 festivals.
Yes.
So just very briefly, on page 169, Amberli has helped to put together this explanation of what some of these festivals are. So you mentioned there's 3 in the spring, 1 in the summer, 3 in the fall.
Yes.
Can you just quickly just go over those for our audience?
Yeah, so Passover, of course, harkens back to when Moses left that night with the people, and that's the first one, and the Lord preserved them and kept them safe as they, and they were able to leave. The destroying angel came, and what did it require for them to be saved? It required the blood of a lamb. So they were to go that day, the night that the destroying angel was coming, they were to obtain a lamb, one for each family. And they were to slit its throat and take that blood and wipe it on the top lintel of their doors.
Just wiped it, or?
Yeah, they were to swipe a hyssop branch, and they were to do that on the tops of their doors, and then on the side doorposts as well. And
just a note here before you go on to that. One thing that we need to understand, and that is that the Egyptians disallowed, it was against the law for them to kill animals within the limits of basically of Egypt.
Yes.
They could not even do sacrifices because of this law.
Yep.
By doing this, essentially they were marking themselves for death.
Which ironically is what saved them. Yes. But in total irony, because some
the
of
Egyptians
these
were going to come through in the morning, and anybody who had defied the law, death was the
absolutely
remedy for if you violated this law of killing animals within the city limits, basically of Egypt.
Right.
So they were literally defying the law and marking themselves personally on their own doors.
Yes.
Basically, so that in the morning, if God doesn't do something to intervene, the Egyptians are going to take your family and they're going to have you killed.
Yep. Yes, because at that time the animals were worshipped, as in the Egyptian system at that point, in the theology at that point, and so it was seen as extremely sacrilegious to be sacrificing these animals. And what people don't always remember is actually Moses, when he first went to Pharaoh, was not saying, "Hey, just let us on all your slaves, slaves, let us leave, because we'll just." All he asked Pharaoh to let them do was to go outside the city limits and do their sacrifices, so that they're away from that they could adhere to the law and not violate or offend the Egyptians or whatever. So he was simply asking, "Let us go out and do our sacrifices that the Lord has commanded, and we will come back." But Pharaoh wouldn't allow that, and so it pushed and pushed and pushed until finally this was the final solution, if you will. But what another thing people sometimes don't always remember about that fateful night was not only did that blood spare that family, but from the destroying angel, but a healing angel, if you will, an angel of light also came through and healed those within that home who had any kind of injury or infirmities. So it wasn't just that there was death, there was life given through that blood. So that blood marked the home where healing was needed and granted. So when they left the next day, there was no infirmity among them, because that blood healed. And that is what's so powerful about this story here, is that his blood heals. That's what it did for us. That's why he shed it for us, to heal us. And that was a very practical example there with that. So Passover then is in remembrance of this, that what happened with that blood of the lamb that saved these people and allowed them to go on to freedom eventually. And that's what his blood does for us today. So, so that was Passover. And then the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins the next day and after, and that's when the Israelites do not eat anything with leaven for the rest of that week, for the 7 days.
You said that the Egyptians, one of the things that were unique about the Egyptians, that they were known as I think you said the bread eaters.
Yes, they were, because that's who developed the idea of yeast in the first place.
And leavening bread,
yes.
and making the bread so it's not hard like a brick, but more like soft and nice. Like
yes,
we are used to it now.
So I believe, and I make this kind of point in here, that the Lord was, when He told them that night to not put leavening in their bread, the night that they were preparing to leave, that they would need to be leaving the next morning, but to not use any leaven in their bread.
What was He trying to accomplish by that?
I think it was symbolically saying, let me take Egypt out of you first. Yes. Leaven represented Egypt, Babylon, puffing up, sophistry, this idea. And I will take Egypt out of you first, and then in the morning I will take you out of Egypt. but on a spiritual level, certainly that's what Jesus does for us. And President Benson has a wonderful quote on this, but basically He takes the slums out of us first, then therefore we can take ourselves out of the slums. And so there's this inner,
as we cleanse the inner vessel,
that's
then we
right.
can become
That's
actually a better dart, if you will, the quiver of the Lord.
The cleaning needs to happen within first.
Yes.
And so this is what's happening on Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's a remembrance of the fact that these people did not use leaven in their bread that night to adhere to the law that Moses said, no leaven in your bread tonight. Be prepared to leave in the morning. And so for the next 7 days, they don't have anything with.
And for more detail about some of that, because there are some specific ways that they get rid of all of the leavening in the bread, and make sure that there's no rising of the bread.
Yep.
And there's some things about that that if you want to know more, it's beautiful symbolism.
Yeah,
and you have to, you just have to see that information from Amberli to know all that. We don't have time to get into details of all that.
It's
That's
really
a lot
neat,
there.
But the next one is Feast of First Fruits, and like I was saying, that is, based on that ripening of barley, because that was the essential act. There was to bring this barley to the priest and have him raise it and do this wave offering, and that was with the sheaf of the first grain of the harvest. And so that was part of that on day 3, and of course that was a nod to the fact, or a prophesying of what he would do on that third day after.
So these first 3 are all in the spring. So you have Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and First Fruits.
And it's actually all within that week time, and they now call the entire thing Pesach, which covers all 3 at once. Yeah.
Okay.
And then in the summer, 50 days after Passover, we have the Feast of Weeks, and that's where wheat is used, because now at this point the wheat is being harvested and used.
The wheat's now finished maturing, basically, and so now it can be harvested.
Yep, and so then they make their bread with that, and that's it also corresponds with the event in the New Testament where they had the I'm losing that word right there.
Pentecost?
Yeah, Pentecost. I'm sorry. And Penta being 5.
Yeah.
So this 50 days thing.
50,
when
5.
They had that great, amazing showing of the power and the tongues and all that happened there in that. So that corresponds with that, and you see that in Ephesians. And then we have the Feast of Trumpets. This starts in the fall. Usually in September, but sometimes October. Depends on how the lunar calendar's lining up. But this is the Feast of Trumpets, and it was a time that the shofar was blown. Well, the shofar was blown throughout all of these. But
does everybody know what a shofar is?
Yeah,
Probably
ram's horn. Yes,
ram's horn. Yeah. And where does that come from?
Yeah, so Moses, blew the shofar up there on Mount Sinai, and it's the horn of a ram, and we know the importance of that ram in with the sacrifice of Isaac.
Abraham and Isaac.
Yeah, Abraham and Isaac, and how that ram came forward, and so that horn is used and blown, and it's to signal call to all of Israel, the calling. Yes, yeah. But in this case with Feast of Trumpets, it's a call to repentance. It's a call to turn back. They call it teshuvah, and it's to turn around. And so this great shofar is blown throughout the land to say, come back, turn around, come back, repent. And it's interesting that's when
come back to Him.
Yes, come back to Him. It's kind of a last call, a clarion call, the gathering. We're going to gather. We're going to regather together, and it's time to come back. Interestingly enough, that's the day that an angel, or Moroni comes to Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
For those 4 years, was always on the Feast of Trumpets. And you can read about that in the Ensign. I talk about it, but Lynette Headley Reid has a great article in the Ensign. I'm not sure which year about that. Yep, it's great.
And for an abbreviated version of that, you can actually go to the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon.
Is it? Oh, good. You have a reference in there.
We have right here.
Right.
It says on page XIX, which is basically 19, I think, if I understand my Roman numerals correctly.
Yeah.
And so September 22nd, 1827, Manchester, New York, Joseph Smith received the plates from Moroni on the Hill Cumorah when they were buried in a stone box. And it even talks about the Feast of Trumpets there.
Yep.
And the significance of how that always happened with Joseph Smith.
Yep.
Amazing the symbolism going on.
Well, wouldn't Moroni,
who
was raised in this, who was raised with these, and then how apropos that this Moroni, he would know all of this. Of course, the Lord did too, but that Moroni would make a point, because what the essence, if you will, of the Feast of Trumpets is, it's the shofar blasts that were meant to signal to Israel that the agricultural year was coming to a close, and signifies Christ's second coming or final gathering for us. So the season, the harvest is here. It's time to bring in this harvest. He's coming. So how interesting is...
The time for planting is over.
Yes.
The time for harvesting is now.
Yes. So Moroni showing up to Joseph at this time with these plates, on this day, this clarion call that it's time to gather in. We need to get ready and prepare for his coming.
Gather all the last, for the last dispensation, to gather them in. Yep. All right.
So then the next we have the Day of Atonement, also known as Yom Kippur, and that happens 10 days after the Feast of Trumpets. And that's when the high priest would go into the Holy Holies, the one day of year that he was able to do that and to make this offering for all the sins of the sins of the nation. Yes. And of course he was dressed all in white, and he would go into this Holy of Holies and scatter the blood on the altar, and it was a messy affair because it was gallons of blood. And when he would come out to declare the people clean, he'd be covered in blood. Yeah. And it was, of course, so symbolic of what he would do for us. And
he would take upon himself our blood, basically.
Yeah. And so actually another thing too is the Feast of Trumpets signaled that the book of life would be opened that day on Yom Kippur, and if your name wasn't in there, then
you're out.
Yeah, but if it was, you'd live for another year. So the other thing that Feast of Trumpets signaled was you have, 10 days to get right with God and your neighbors and your friends and get your names on the list, because that book is going to open. And then, and so sure enough, that's what happens. And it's symbolic of when God will come back, or, and Christ will do that, who did that for us, but that he's coming back. So, and then the last one is the Feast of Tabernacles, and this one's a joyful one. It's a celebration, if you will. Some look at it like the marriage celebration of the bridegroom returning for his bride, and it's a beautiful one. And it lasts 7 days, and they present these offerings to the Lord, but they construct these booths. And that's why sometimes it's called the Feast of Booths. But they construct these booths after the manner, or to represent the children of Israel living.
They're supposed to be basically outside.
Yeah, and they're outside.
So
they are outside.
It's not like somebody put a little tent inside their house.
No,
it's outside.
Outside, and you can see in New York City during this time that they're outside on their porches and their balconies.
Their balconies, and
yes,
because
they have to have access to the sky to see His greatness and glory of God, and have that. Of course, it's a beautiful thing, and so, but it represents His covering, that He covered them in the wilderness and led them and protected them, and He protected them. Yes, He protected them. So it's a glory to them, and so it just is just a glory, a happy one. There's celebration, there's feasting. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Some of these actually include fasting and those kind of things. When we were talking to some of our Native American friends, Mike and Betty LaFontaine, and they talked about how many Native American tribes have similar kinds of ceremonies and similar fasting and feasting and these kind of things that are going on, which are kind of throwbacks to their ancestral heritage as Israelites.
Yeah. Oh, very much so. They have a feast of the green corn moon in the spring, about planting and harvesting. There's beautiful similarities that are still out there and going there with our Native American friends.
You bet.
Thank you for listening to the Book of Mormon Evidence podcast. If you like this Come Follow Me supplemental study, click the like button and share it with your friends. Be sure to go to bookofmormonevidence.org, which is a hub with all the links that you would like to the podcasts, to upcoming events, the store, 200 plus answers about the Book of Mormon, as well as links to our streaming site, which now has over 100 new videos from our virtual expo. If you want to see the expo, go to comefollowme2020.org, and you can also see them on the streaming site, bookofmormonevidencestreaming.com.